On Valentine's Day, a big shot in the Beijing circle publicly courted his wife in a high-profile manner. He not only forced a plane to stop in public but also directly posted a message on the official Weibo account of the group. Darling, I was wrong. Yvonne, the person he tagged, was a popular actress known as the sober, independent leading lady in the entertainment industry. On that day, the actress herself replied haughtily, "Do not disturb. I might as well have fed the past 5 years to a dog." Netizens were all hooked on this couple and exclaimed that it was like a scene of chasing the wife after making a big mistake. Except for me. Because today is the 10th anniversary of my marriage to the big shot in the Beijing circle. When Carson forced the plane to stop, I was also on it. I walked all the way down from the first-class cabin and heard everyone around me speculating about the identity of the man who forced the plane to stop. Nen, what on Allah sai? The crowd let out a burst of exclamations. I turned my head along the direction of their gaze and saw my husband forcefully pressing a woman into his arms. After a moment of argument between the two, they passionately kissed in public without caring about anything else. I was so close that I could even see the blue veins bulging on the back of his hand due to the force. And the ambiguous sounds of their lips and tongues intertwined. Overbearing and assertive. Just like he was with me back then. The woman was wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap, and she was dressed very conservatively. But I still recognized who she was at a glance. Yvonne. A popular actress. She was also the mistress my husband had kept for 7 years. The situation continued to develop. Everyone was cheering and taking photos. Only I, as if trying to escape something, gradually averted my gaze. But the next second, Carson was forcefully pushed away. And then he gritted his teeth while clutching Yvonne's neck and said, "Can't you just give me one more chance? Just because I said one wrong thing. You've been avoiding me for a month?" Yvonne's lips were swollen and red. But she sneered and replied, "What?" Carson himself said, "But I'm just a plaything for him." "You actually believe something he said casually. I've only loved you in my entire life. Why don't you believe this?" Carson's roar successfully rooted me to the spot. My body trembled. And these words kept replaying in my mind. Until our eyes met. He seemed not to expect that I was also there. And his hand holding Yvonne's clearly caused. I was silent for a moment, then suppressed my emotions and said calmly, "Let's go home. It's not appropriate for you to be flirting with others here considering your status." Before Carson could speak, we heard Yvonne snort coldly and say, "What? Does the status of Mrs. Carson make you superior?" I looked at her calmly. And she raised her chin with an unyielding posture. This kind of pride of not fearing power had been praised many times in the entertainment industry. I remember that Carson was attracted to her because of this. Otherwise? I smiled faintly, and said. Yvonne clenched her fists and suddenly shook off Carson's hand vigorously. "Please stay away from me. Carson. I'm not worthy of touching you with my status." Carson frowned, and when he looked at me again, there was a hint of impatience in his expression. "Wife. You didn't used to be so fussy." His tone was unhurried, but the meaning behind his words was piercing. He thought I had hurt Yvonne's self-esteem. My eyelashes fluttered slightly, and when I pinched my palm with my fingertips, I found that there was already blood oozing out. I don't know how I left. I only remember that when I was sitting in the car, I was very tired. Yvonne was not the first mistress Carson had kept, but she was the most special one. He invested resources in her and helped her become a best actress. At the height of his publicity, people who wanted Carson to do something would approach Yvonne. But every time I asked about it, Carson would always say nonchalantly that it was just for fun. He told me not to take Yvonne seriously, that she was just a little star. He would throw her away once he got tired of her. But later, they were entangled for 5 years. During these 5 years, Yvonne was the only mistress by Carson's side. In this situation, Yvonne once took the initiative to find me. At that time, she raised her chin and said calmly to me, "Carson and I are just in a relationship of money and body. I'm very clear-headed and won't covet things I shouldn't. I hope Mrs. Carson won't take me to heart." Clear-headed. I smiled. But it was such a woman who considered herself clear-headed that when she accidentally heard Carson say that he was just playing with her, Not only did she pour a glass of wine over Carson's head in public, but she also said word by word with red eyes, I've fulfilled my obsession. Yvonne. Am not so cheap. I can live well without a man. That day, Carson had a dark face and told Yvonne to get out. But when he got home later, he suddenly broke down and kicked over the table in a fit of rage. I looked at the broken bowls on the ground and the ginseng soup it had spilled all over the floor, and I remained silent. Carson knew that I had cooked the ginseng soup, just like I knew that Carson had already fallen in love with Yvonne. After I got home, I checked the internet. The topic "Big Shot forced a plane to stop just for love" had already appeared on the hot search. In the comment section, everyone was speculating about the identity of this big shot. Some insiders even revealed that this big shot came from a prestigious family in the Beijing circle, and his identity was not to be disclosed. I calmly called the public relations department of the company. The exposure of this kind of romantic scandal not only shamed me, it also had a great impact on Carson's personal reputation. After all, using power to occupy public resources will arouse public anger. I called and calmly ordered, don't let netizens connect the two of them. And don't expose Carson's identity. If necessary, have necessary. Contact the media to clarify the situation. But just after I finished speaking, the manager of the public relations department hesitated and said, Madame, Mr. Carson just asked me for the password of the group's official Weibo account. I instinctively had a bad feeling in my heart. But I never expected that Carson would embarrass me like this. On the page, Carson directly tagged Yvonne using the official Weibo account of the John Group. John Group, darling. I was wrong. Yvonne, I was wrong. Only then did I finally wake up as if from a dream. Yvonne was not just the most special one to Carson. She was the only and unique one. Even I couldn't compare to her. After all, in 10 years of marriage, Carson had never admitted he was wrong to me. Even when I first found out that he had a mistress outside, he just smiled and said, Wife, men are all like this. But I promise that no one can move your position. A new topic had already appeared on the hot search. It was Yvonne's response. Yvonne, do not disturb. I might as well have fed the past 5 years to a dog. As soon as these words came out, it was immediately followed by a Weibo hot search. Sober and independent leading lady Yvonne John Group and Yvonne Big Shot in the Beijing circle publicly courting his wife. Yvonne, these 3 topics each precisely stepped on my dignity. In the comment section, countless people were celebrating. No wonder she's the sober leading lady in the entertainment industry. Even a big shot in the Beijing circle can't scare my sister. The world is like a huge romance novel. This is our independent leading lady. Clear-headed, decisive, and never relying on men. So I'm one of those netizens whose minds are blown when the male and female lead relationship is exposed. So is the plot at the stage of chasing the wife after making a big mistake now? I took a deep breath and closed my phone with trembling fingertips. He's chasing his wife. So what am I? Carson might have forgotten why I was on that plane. And he also forgot that today is the 10th anniversary of our marriage. But I still want to ask him. So what am I? I didn't get the answer until Carson came home. He ignored my embarrassment and instead smiled casually and said, Wife? Since when did you start caring about Bess? She's just a little star. Where is it worth your trouble? I couldn't hide my emotions in my tone and said coldly. Then what if I ask you to break up with this little star? I've tried. Carson lowered his head and took a puff of a cigarette, half closing his eyes and looking out the window. And he slowly exhaled a puff of smoke and said, But every night I miss her. I miss her like crazy. The tenderness in his tone made me feel sick. My chest felt as if a huge stone was pressing on it, making it stuffy. I clenched my fingertips and said with difficulty, Carson, couldn't fulfill why I'd say. Do you think I can't live without you? Carson paused for a moment. After a while, he let out a low laugh. He said firmly, Wife, you know that we can't live without each other. I twitched the corners of my mouth. 10 years of marriage. It's indeed very difficult to end it. This is the handle that Carson uses to trap me. And it's also the handle that I use to trap him. But I always remember that we once truly wanted to be together for a lifetime. When we first met, Carson was 7 years old and I was 5. when we were just starting to feel the stirrings of love. I was 18 and Carson was 20. We'd been together for so many years. And getting married became a natural and necessary thing to do. At that time, everyone thought that he loved me deeply. Until the 3rd year of our marriage. He started keeping mistresses. At first, he would hide it from me. But the truth can't be hidden forever. The first time I found out, Carson was flustered. Then the second time. The third time. The fourth time. He started to confess to me. "Wife. I'm just curious about them." At that time, Carson was smoking a cigarette and calmly said to me, "I know clearly who I love and who my wife is. But there's no more passion between us." I listened to his words. And my heart ached. But everyone was persuading me that men in this circle are all like this. Carson is already very good. I couldn't figure out why. But I couldn't bear to part with the friendship of more than 10 years. So I could only choose to compromise. But now, I suddenly don't want to compromise anymore. Carson didn't stay tonight. Even though he knew that today was the 10th anniversary of our marriage. He still didn't stay. Before he left, he seemed a bit hesitant. He said to me, "Wife, I have a business dinner tonight. I've already prepared today's gift." He leaned over and kissed my forehead, and then handed me a gift box, which contained jewelry worth tens of millions. But I didn't have the mood to look at it anymore. I stared at his departing back. Until the phone rang. "Claire, did you see that hot search? Carson is going to fire this time. He's trampling on your dignity to the extreme for a star. Doesn't he know that people in this circle are all mocking you because of this?" My best friend's voice came through the phone. I lowered my eyes and said awkwardly, "He knows. He knows all the consequences. But he still did it." My best friend was speechless. And then angrily said, "It's too much. I'll find you a few handsome guys too. And you can have some fun too." Over the years, my best friend has said many similar things. But I've never gone out to find someone. But this time, I hesitated. "Do you remember that poor college boy I introduced to you last time?" My best friend's voice rang out again. "You didn't take him that time. But you ordered several bottles of Arm and Diebrignac for him. That handsome guy has now entered the entertainment industry." A man with delicate eyebrows and clear eyes gradually emerged in my memory. At that time, my best friend told me that something had happened to his family. And he was now earning money to pay off debts. He had just started. And he was still a virgin. I didn't take him. But out of kindness, I ordered him several of the most expensive bottles of wine so that he could get commissions to pay off his debts. At that time, my best friend laughed at me for being silly and said that I couldn't believe such things. I never saw that person again after that. "Nina, I'm really tired now." I sighed and didn't continue the call. The jewelry on the table sparkled brightly. But it looked extremely lonely. Carson had a perfect understanding of my state of mind. He was certain that I wouldn't give up on him easily. But when the time ticked to 10 o'clock in the evening, I suddenly wanted to give it a try. On the 10th anniversary of my marriage to him. When I was filled with so many thoughts and worries about him. What was he doing? The phone rang for a long time. But no one answered. I asked the assistant in a roundabout way. The answer I got was that Carson wasn't in the company. And there were no business entertainments in the company either. The assistant who usually never left his side was now at home. I stared at the phone for a long time. And then, not giving up, I dialed again. After a few seconds, the phone was answered. But the voice that came from the phone made my heart ache as if it had fallen into an ice cave. "Mrs. Carson, your husband is taking a shower." The woman who had been so haughty and decisive during the day now had an obviously hoarse voice. She said impatiently, "Can you stop calling?" I stared at the jewelry for a long time. The emotions in my eyes were finally suppressed. "Yvonne, we need to meet." I calmed my breathing and said softly. Yvonne didn't know what she was thinking. But she didn't decline and instead made an appointment with me for a location. I put down my phone and stared blankly at the jewelry. The next day, I waited for Yvonne in the reserved private room. This place had good privacy. So Yvonne didn't dress as conservatively as she did yesterday. She had red lips and looked like a proud white swan. Even when she saw me, The arrogance in her eyes and brows didn't diminish in the slightest. "Mrs. Carson, you can start first." Yvonne touched her belly and lifted her chin at me. I took out the documents in my hand and said directly, "You're Carson's mistress. And you're after resources and money. Then name your price and leave him." When Yvonne heard the word mistress, her brows furrowed slightly. When she heard the last sentence, a trace of anger appeared on her face. "Mrs. Carson, allow me to say something first. You rely on men to have your current status. What right do you have to talk to me in such a superior manner?" She spoke word by word, full of mockery. I looked at her and suddenly let out a soft laugh. "There's one thing you're wrong about. Even if I hadn't married Carson, I would still be able to talk to you in a superior manner. And if you weren't his mistress, you wouldn't even have the right to listen to me. After all, Carson and I were a good match in terms of family background." The family background he had, I also had. Yvonne's face twisted for a moment. I clearly saw the jealousy in her eyes that she couldn't hide. But the next second, Yvonne suddenly let out a cold laugh. She stared at me intently, with blatant provocation in her eyes and brows. "Is that so? And I have something to tell Mrs. Carson. I'm pregnant." These words made my heart skip a beat, and a hint of pallor appeared on my face. She was pregnant with Carson's child. Yvonne sneered disdainfully. "Mrs. Carson, you've been married to Carson for 10 years. It seems you still don't have a child. Right? Is it that you can't have children?" The malice in her words came rushing towards me. My eyelashes fluttered slightly, and I tried my best to suppress my emotions and said softly, "In that case, abort it. And I can give you 50 million yuan." Yvonne said, "Impossible. Yvonne, you need to know. An illegitimate child is only worth this much," I said casually, maintaining a very haughty posture. Yvonne's face turned green with anger, and she stood up and slapped me hard. The sting on my cheek made me taste the sweet smell of blood instantly. "How dare you humiliate me like this?" Yvonne gritted her teeth in anger. I touched my cheek, unable to figure out why someone could be so bold. The next second, the 2 bodyguards behind me strode forward and pressed Yvonne to the ground. She struggled like crazy until she exhausted her strength. Her eyes were still staring at me fiercely. I stood up and walked in front of her. But before I could do anything, "What are you doing?" After a roar, the door of the private room was opened, and Carson walked in with a dark face. He looked at the scene in front of him, clenched his fists, and said coldly, "Let go." The bodyguards didn't dare to disobey his order. After letting go, Yvonne's eyes were red, and she looked at him stubbornly. A trace of pity clearly flashed in his eyes, but it completely disappeared when he turned to look at me. "Wife." He forced a smile and said, "Why do such a demeaning thing for a little star?" But the tone of his words was full of accusations. I looked at him, and a strange feeling welled up in my heart. I wasn't the first one he responded to. Yvonne wiped away her tears, as if she had suffered a great deal of grievance. She roared, "Yes. I'm just a lowly little star and I deserve to be trampled on by you. How ridiculous. I actually wanted to give birth to this child. How could I be worthy of it?" After she finished speaking, Carson was stunned on the spot. After a long while, he said in disbelief, "You're pregnant?" After he said that, he subconsciously turned to look at me. Then he stammered, "Wife. I really. Carson. I've said it before. If you have an illegitimate child, I will divorce you." My words made Carson frown even more. But the next second, Yvonne let out a cold laugh and said, "Don't worry. I know my place and won't make things difficult for your wife. I'll go and abort it right now." After saying that, she turned around and resolutely strode out of the private room. Carson's face suddenly turned flustered, and he almost instinctively followed her out. I even heard his anxious and angry voice outside the door, "Yvonne. How dare you?" My heart sank completely. Like a pool of stagnant water. It couldn't stir up any waves anymore. So this was what it felt like to lose all hope. I looked at the empty doorway and finally laughed out loud. Go to Ling Xiang Club. I also walked out of the private room and got into the car. When I arrived, The private room was filled with flashing lights. Nina, who was drunk, leaned over. What? Have you thought it through? I nodded. I won't allow anything that harms my interests to happen. So, I'm going to get a divorce. Come on. Enjoy yourself to the fullest. Nina raised her glass and smiled. Lost in a world of indulgence. I sighed and helped her onto the sofa. Then I asked the waiter to lead me to the restroom. But as soon as I got to the restroom, a man in a white suit leaned over. Save me. He grabbed my hand. And his eyes were slightly red. Behind him, several men seemed to recognize my identity and stopped in their tracks, not daring to come forward. I slowly took the man's hand away, admired his fragile and delicate face with a look of despair on it, and then said, "This is my man. What are you doing?" The few men were stunned for a moment. And after reacting, they quickly bent over to apologize. I didn't respond and pulled the man, who was still in a daze. What's wrong? Weren't the few bottles of Arm and Dubrignac I ordered for you last time enough for you to pay off your debts? After arriving at the private room, I casually asked. Because the man in front of me was exactly the poor college boy who had come to sell wine out of necessity due to family troubles. I heard that he had now entered the entertainment industry. It seemed that he hadn't earned any money and had come to sell wine again. The man pursed his thin lips tightly, and a trace of nervousness appeared on his youthful face. No, he said in a low voice. The debts have been paid off already. After saying that, as if he thought of something, he added, I was tricked here. Then he lowered his eyes, looking innocent and pitiful. I nodded inferently and didn't say anything. Until the end. I asked someone to send Nina home, and then I planned to leave with my several bodyguards. However, as soon as I stood up, my sleeve was grabbed by a hand. Can I go with you? The man, who had been as still as a delicate doll, suddenly asked. I looked at his slightly red eyes and his slightly pursed lips due to nervousness and remained silent. After a long while, I said, What's your name? Ryan? You can live here from now on. This is the house where I will often stay. I sat on the sofa and watched as Ryan curiously looked around the environment. Then he turned around, lowered his eyes, and the tips of his ears turned slightly red. Will you often come and live with me here in the future? I said. It depends on my mood. As soon as I finished speaking, the phone rang. It was from Carson. I hesitated for a moment and then answered the call. Wife. I will try my best to make you happy. The two voices sounded one after the other. Ryan didn't hear Carson's voice and was still looking at me with his eyes slightly bright. But Carson clearly heard Ryan's voice. The phone went silent. After a long time, he finally said, Wife, are you trying to get back at me? I glanced at Ryan and said softly, I'm just following my desires. What? You can have a mistress. But I can't? Following your desires? Carson repeated these words word by word, and his voice became more and more gloomy. Finally, hadn't fulfilled my absai. He took a deep breath and laughed. Of course you can. Since it's your first time finding someone, why don't you bring him over for me to take a look? In case you meet someone with ill intentions or someone who is not well behaved, I can also help you deal with it. I sneered. After a few seconds, I said, No need. He's very innocent. I'm afraid you'll scare him. After I finished speaking, the breathing on the other end of the phone suddenly became heavier. I hung up the phone and said to Ryan, Come with me to a place tomorrow. The second time I met Nina was at a banquet held in the circle. This time, however, there were a lot more people. Ryan sat beside me, looking inexperienced as he endured the scrutiny of the people around him. I knew why you were suddenly so kind last time. So you had already taken a fancy to him. Nina burst into laughter, wearing an expression of someone who knows a lot about relationships. I just smiled faintly and didn't say anything. Not far away, Carson and Devon were sitting on the sofa. There was a circle of people around them chatting with him. His hand was resting on Yvonne's waist, as if he didn't care about what was going on here at all. Nina also glanced in that direction. She blinked and suddenly patted Ryan on the shoulder. Little handsome guy. Being so stiff like this will get you dumped. You know. Ryan looked at her, at a loss. She glanced at me, and then raised her eyebrows. Why don't you take the initiative and give her a kiss? Ryan looked at my reaction. Seeing that I didn't show any expression, his eyelashes fluttered slightly. He slowly leaned over and kissed me. I thought it would just be a quick peck, but unexpectedly, he kissed my lips again and started to gently nibble on them. This kiss became long and ambiguous, until there was a loud bang. The huge noise made everyone at the banquet fall silent, and they all looked towards the source of the sound. It was Carson, who suddenly kicked over the table in front of him. I slowly pushed the person on me away, and calmly met the gaze of the man with red eyes. After a few seconds, Carson pushed away Yvonne, who was still holding on to him, and strode towards me. He stared intently at Ryan and said coldly, "Wife, is this the kind of person you found?" I looked at him, and he shifted his gaze to me and sneered, "Break it off. Don't embarrass me." Ryan seemed to realize something. He pursed his lips and said, "If Carson has any grievances, he can come at me. I know I'm not good enough for Claire. But what right do you have to humiliate me like this? I just want to repay Claire and make her happy." Carson frowned tightly, so angry that he laughed. "Me humiliating you? My wife. Why would she need you to make her happy?" Ryan lowered his eyes and said in a low voice, "Yes, what? It's all my fault." His cold and stubborn reaction formed a sharp contrast with Carson's furious and agitated appearance. Anyone who saw it would think that Carson was being unreasonable. I thought so too. I patted Ryan's shoulder soothingly and said softly, "You're not at fault. Don't think you're not worthy." Then I raised my eyes to look at Carson and frowned. "Are you done making a scene?" Carson became even angrier. He stared at me with a dark face and said word by word, "Fine," let out a low sigh. "You're really something." After the banquet ended, I went back to my parents' house and talked to my father. Divorcing Carson involved a lot of things. After discussing it with my parents, I asked our family's private lawyer to draw up a divorce agreement. Back then, I got together with Carson because of love. So now I've decided to leave. My parents just asked me if I had really thought it through or if I was just being impulsive out of anger. I sighed and said calmly, "Mom, from the first time Carson cheated until now, I've been in a state of confusion for 8 years." My mother fell silent. Then, without a low sigh, I sent the divorce agreement to Carson, who was still waiting for me at home. After that, I went to find Ryan. On the way, I saw that the hot search terms that had been at the top of the list for many days finally changed. Yvonne. Pregnant Yvonne, my child is the most precious. When I clicked in, it was a picture of Yvonne's pregnancy test result posted on her Weibo account with the caption, "Yvonne, my child is the most precious. I love him. Anyone who belittles my child will get their comeuppance." In the comment section of the Weibo post, there was another wave of excitement. "Is the child the heir's Carson's? Wayuushu. He's finally gotten his wife back. What does sister mean? Is there someone jealous of sister?" I smiled and turned off my phone. When I got home, I received a call from Carson. He had obviously received the package. I could feel the accusation and anger in his words, even through the internet connection. "Divorce? Wife? I'm not seeing things. Am I?" "Yeah. Just sign it," I said, lying on the sofa and looking at Ryan, who was busy in the kitchen. I added, "I told you. If you have an illegitimate child, I will definitely divorce you." Carson took a deep breath and said, "Wife? Who said I'd let her have the baby? I only love you. And only you can have my child." I smiled. "Do as you like. But even without an illegitimate child, I'm still planning to divorce you." Carson's breath caught. After a while, he gritted his teeth and asked, "Is it because of that pretty boy?" I casually hummed in agreement. I could clearly hear the sound of a cup being smashed on the floor through the phone. Carson's voice lost its usual calmness, and he suddenly became furious. "Claire, are you deliberately trying to get back at me? I'm telling you, I will never divorce you. And I will never let you be with that pretty boy." I listened quietly to his voice gradually losing control, and suddenly felt very annoyed. "Carson, save some dignity for yourself. If you don't sign the papers today, I'll directly file for divorce in court. You know that if I want a divorce, you can't stop me at all." After saying that, I hung up the phone without paying attention to Carson's suddenly trembling tone. Beside me, Ryan heard what I said. He looked at me a little nervously and murmured, "You're getting a divorce? And it's because of me?" I knew he had obviously misunderstood something. So I said directly, "It has nothing to do with you. I just don't want to be with him anymore. I don't have such deep feelings for Ryan yet. I just want someone by my side. And he just happens to be someone I find to my liking and interesting. I'll give you this house. In the future, if you have any needs for resources in the entertainment industry, I can also help you with that." I stood up, looked at him and said, "I don't have many demands on you. Just be obedient and loyal." After hearing my words, Ryan pursed his lips. "Clear. Since I've accepted the benefits you've given me, I will try my best to be a qualified lover. Being obedient and loyal are just the basics. You can definitely ask more of me." I smiled. He was quite sensible. "All right. Then come over this afternoon and be my bag carrier." At first, I just thought Ryan was a newcomer in the entertainment industry. So I didn't try to hide anything. It wasn't until we were at the mall and were secretly photographed by different people that I realized he had already become somewhat famous in the circle. The last time he was tricked by a perverted big shot, it was also because he had recently played a very popular role and happened to catch that person's eye. This was the first time I saw my face on the hot search. "Claire, I've caused you trouble." Ryan apologized to me guiltily after contacting his manager. I rubbed my eyebrows and waved my hand at him. However, there was someone who cared more than I did. The public opinion storm was getting more and more intense, and netizens quickly dug up my identity. People in the industry didn't dare to say that I was married, so a large number of netizens were wildly envious, jealous, and hateful, saying that Ryan had latched onto a rich and beautiful woman. I suddenly felt that this situation was somewhat similar to what happened with Carson before. This is quite interesting. I smiled and followed Ryan's Weibo account using the Weibo account of the company under my name. With this action, the hot search exploded directly. In the evening, when Ryan came back and saw me, his face clearly showed a lot more excitement. "I thought you didn't want me anymore. Haven't you seen the Weibo?" I took a sip of coffee and said. Only then did Ryan remember to open his phone. "Does this have a big impact on you?" I asked again. "Not really," Ryan said obediently, after looking at his phone. "I make a living with my acting skills. Not as an idol." All in all, he would lose some fans, but it wouldn't affect his ability to get acting jobs. I nodded and then waved at him. He leaned over, looked into my eyes, and then hugged me. My gaze fell on his lips. Ryan was very good looking, especially his eyes. And then there were his lips. Sensing my gaze, Ryan's ears turned red. He lowered his head and kissed me. After a long kiss, our clothes were gradually unbuttoned, until the doorbell rang. I opened my eyes and saw Ryan's dazed and infatuated face. There was still my lipstick mark on his lips. "Go and open the door," I said. His Adam's apple bobbed, and he hummed in agreement. He strode towards the door. Then, "Went out," I heard Carson's voice. "What the hell are you doing?" I frowned, tidied up my clothes, and walked to the door as well. As soon as I went out, I saw Carson grabbing Ryan by the collar. His eyes fixed on the lipstick mark on Ryan's lips and the hickey on his neck. When he saw me, the anger in his eyes grew even stronger. He stared at me almost furiously, and said, "Did you two sleep together?" I knew I probably looked the same as Ryan at this moment, but I didn't feel the least bit guilty. I had already sued Carson for divorce. Even if he didn't agree, the divorce was going to happen. "You're ruining my mood," I said coldly. Carson's eyes were red, and his chest was heaving violently. He brought up another matter. "Wife, we're still not divorced. Aren't you afraid of people finding out that you're married if you're so eager to show your affection with him?" Ryan asked in confusion. But I remember that Carson publicly announced his relationship with Yvonne in public before. I sneered and looked at Carson, who was in an unstable emotional state. "See, hadn't fulfilled my obsession. I'm just doing the same thing as you did. Why can't you accept it when it's you on the receiving end?" Carson was left speechless. Just then, let out a lull sigh. Yvonne walked out from behind him. Carson. Since Mrs. Carson already has a new lover. There's no need for us to spoil her mood. I looked at her and suddenly smiled. Don't call me Mrs. Carson anymore. I won't be that soon. This sentence obviously made Carson's expression freeze. Looking at my calm expression, he finally realized that I was really determined to divorce him. When he spoke again, his voice was hoarse and filled with a hint of pain. We've been together for almost 20 years. Do you really not want me anymore? I looked at him and said coldly. It was you who abandoned me. Carson froze on the spot immediately. After a while, he glanced at Yvonne. A trace of determination flashed in his eyes. I've said it before. I won't want this child. I will make her have an abortion. And I will also leave her. As long as you're still willing to come back. As soon as he finished speaking, Yvonne's expression changed drastically. She looked at Carson in disbelief. And her face turned worse and worse. Why? This is my child. How dare you make me abort him? Carson didn't look at her. And just said calmly. Yvonne. Wake up. Recognize your own position. Hearing these words, I suddenly smiled. However, Yvonne, who had always regarded herself as sober and independent, couldn't accept it. Her emotions gradually got out of control. Carson. How dare you humiliate me like this? Carson looked at her and said again. We were just in a relationship based on money. You shouldn't have gotten pregnant with my child. I admit that I do have some true feelings for you. But my wife and I have been in a relationship for 20 years. Yvonne's eyes were red. And she covered her stomach. Breathing rapidly. She cursed in pain. You're a beast. It was so disgusting. Carson's words seemed to be a sincere confession. But they made me feel nauseous. Ryan beside me noticed my discomfort. He frowned and stood in front of me. Carson. Don't be too rude. If there's nothing else, please leave. Carson's face suddenly darkened. Who the hell are you? Ryan's expression remained unchanged. Even though he was humiliated like this, he still firmly stood in front of me and said seriously. I'm Claire's lover. Carson's breathing became heavier. Out of anger, he strode forward, but was stopped in his tracks by my words. Carson. Stop making me feel sick. There was nothing but disgust in my eyes and brows. Ignoring his gradually breaking down reaction, I directly closed the door. Do you want me to call the security guards? Ryan said behind me. I turned around and raised my chin at him. Continue. Ryan was slightly stunned. After reacting, he blushed and stepped forward to hug me. I don't know what Carson and Yvonne said outside the door, nor when they left. All I knew was that after a passionate night, when I woke up again, there were overwhelming wedding photos of me and Carson all over the internet. He actually went crazy and used his official Weibo account to post our marriage certificate, responding to the rumors about me and Ryan on the trending searches. John Group, wife. I was wrong. This move made his previous deep affection for Yvonne a laughingstock. Huh? They'd been married for 10 years. Then what was all that so-called deep affection before? Is he crazy? What's going on? So is Ryan also being a mistress? Hilarious. He was having an affair with a female celebrity before. And now his wife is with a male celebrity. And he's getting anxious? Not only that, but Yvonne's Weibo comment section also collapsed. They've been married for 10 years? So you were being a mistress for 5 years with that big shot? So shameless. How can you still pretend to be free and easy after being a mistress for 5 years? So, sis, the child in your belly is an illegitimate child? No wonder someone looks down on him. I'll never believe the person as a female celebrities again. So funny. On the surface, a sober and independent leading lady. In reality, being a mistress for 5 years and getting pregnant with an illegitimate child. I rubbed my forehead and turned off my phone. Then I called the lawyer and told him to win the lawsuit as soon as possible. Ryan hugged me from behind and said dejectedly. Some people are also scolding me. I paused and reached out to touch his soft hair. It's okay. I'll deal with it. Ryan kissed my ear and whispered. Can I call you sister? Sure. You can. I'm 32 years old this year. And I remember Ryan is 23 years old this year. It seems okay for him to call me sister. I smiled. No wonder Carson would keep a mistress. It really is comfortable. After sorting out my thoughts, I started to deal with these online public opinions. I posted a clarification on the official Weibo account of the group. The divorce proceedings are ongoing. There's no future between me and Carson anymore. Please don't pester us too much. As soon as this Weibo post came out, netizens began to speculate that I chose to divorce because I was deeply hurt by Carson. In fact, that's exactly the case. I liked a comment that was more or less in line with the truth. Then there was another wave of scolding. All the anger of the people was focused on Carson and Yvonne. During this period, Carson's parents called me. But I didn't answer. From the moment the lawsuit started, everyone knew that I really wanted to divorce him. After that, I didn't show up until the day I won the lawsuit. When I arrived, I found out that Carson had been there for the past few days. He tried to find countless pieces of evidence to show that the relationship between me and him hadn't broken down. However, it was useless. He had been addicted to cheating all these years. There were too many pieces of evidence. My parents are not to be trifled with either. Claire, if I pursue you again, is there still a possibility for us to be together? Carson's voice rang in my ear. I looked at his obviously haggard figure and left without saying a word. There's no possibility. Claire, am not someone who likes to go back to an old relationship. What's more, I've been with this relationship for too many years. After leaving the gate of the court, I saw Yvonne in front of the car. Her belly had already grown bigger. But her face was very haggard. When she saw me, her face twisted for a moment and she said, "You can trample on others' self-esteem with just a flick of your finger. Are you very proud of that?" I stopped and looked at her with a sneer. Your self-esteem was already gone when you willingly became a mistress for a man and exchanged your body for resources. Yvonne was furious. She probably thought that since she was pregnant, I wouldn't dare to touch her. She actually came up and tried to hit me. My eyes narrowed slightly, and I directly slapped her backhand. It was to avenge the slap I received that day. I didn't bring bodyguards this time. After being slapped by me, Yvonne instinctively tried to fight back, but someone directly grabbed her hand. It was Ryan. Yvonne was so angry that she cursed, "Bitch. You're not a good person either. So what if I'm a mistress? You still couldn't resist the temptation and had an affair during your marriage." Ryan frowned and said, "Yvonne, you should keep your mouth clean. It's too harsh to ask a woman to stay loyal to her husband who is addicted to cheating." Yvonne let out a cold laugh. I didn't refute her. Instead, I patted her face with the divorce certificate and smiled. "The difference between me and you is that I've always had my self-esteem. And you're probably still praying for Carson to come back to you. Right? Is this what you call being sober?" Yvonne's face turned pale and red as her thoughts were exposed. Carson didn't want her anymore. Not only that, but he also forced her to abort the child in her belly. And everyone knew about these things. Carson did it openly, and didn't leave Yvonne any face. I clicked my tongue and left with Ryan. The matter was finally considered over when I took a photo of the divorce certificate and posted it online. I didn't pay attention to what happened after that. Even if Carson went crazy on the internet every day, begging for my forgiveness, I didn't look at him again. Everyone said that since the eldest son of the Carson family got divorced, his mental state had not been normal. Not only did he force the mistress he once loved the most to abort their child, but he was also ridiculed and insulted on the internet like a monkey. As for Yvonne, her career was ruined after the abortion. Carson didn't protect her, and she became a tainted artist. I heard that she was still pestering Carson, asking him to compensate her. When I heard these things, I just laughed it off as a joke. I once loved and hated this relationship, but after all, I still have most of my life ahead to live freely. The past is like the wind, and I only focus on the present. Extra from Ryan's perspective, the first time I met Claire was the most embarrassing moment in my life. My father was deceived and owed a huge debt. So he jumped off a tall building. My mother couldn't bear the blow and had a heart attack, and I had just started college. I tried all the methods I could think of. But I still couldn't raise the medical expenses. So, I threw away my self-esteem and dignity, and chose a path full of despair. Until I met her. That day. She looked melancholy. And there was an indelible sadness between her brows. I learned it from others that this was a woman betrayed by her husband. I couldn't understand why such a beautiful woman would be betrayed. If she were my wife, I would definitely treat her well. After this thought came to my mind, I stood there stunned. Then I smiled bitterly. It was the first time I felt the stirrings of love, but it was in such an embarrassed and gloomy moment. I knew that there was a huge gap between our identities, and I didn't have any delusions. But I didn't expect that she would help me. This commission didn't cure my mother's illness. My mother still passed away. So, I used it to pay off the debt. And the delusion in my heart gradually burned. She didn't want me that day. And I wasn't willing to give up. I entered the entertainment industry and started asking around for news about her. Until that time, someone told me that she was at that club. So I decided to take a gamble. My steps froze in place. And it took a long time for me to relax. When I arrived, I gambled that she would soften her heart towards me. I succeeded. I became her only lover. I was very satisfied. Later, when I heard that she was going to divorce her husband, I secretly laughed under the quilt. A mistress who doesn't want to be the main wife is not a good mistress. I knew I wasn't worthy, but it didn't stop me from secretly thinking about it. Later on, her ex-husband started to pursue her frantically. Until one day, he was hit and broke his leg by that crazy female celebrity. I nervously peeked at her expression and found that there was actually a trace of schadenfreude on her face. Only then did I feel relieved. She really wouldn't get back together with him. As time went by, year after year, every year, I was worried that she might get tired of me. Fortunately, that didn't happen. Every year, I was the only lover by her side. I thought contentedly that although I didn't have a proper status, she didn't have a main wife either.